Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we're meeting today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name is Tom Simonson. I'm the CEO of the Victorian Healthcare Association, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the second webinar in our Catalyst for Change series. This series of webinars has been designed to support Victorian healthcare organisations as they transition to the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Throughout these webinars, we will explore the change framework and playbook for change for the NDIS transition, which has been co-created by the VHA and the Business of Health. Hopefully you all have a copy of the playbook. It has been shared with your CEOs and communications teams and is also available on our website via the Wire portal, as will recorded versions of these webinars. I'd like to acknowledge the generous support of the Department of Health and Human Services in funding this piece of work through the NDIS Transition Support Package Programme. We all know that the enormous reforms that the sector has been involved with through the National Disability Insurance Scheme, not to mention other reforms in the aged care system, have been extremely complex. We've developed the playbook and designed the webinar series in response to an identified need. We've heard that as healthcare professionals, we're not always change experts. And so this framework and supporting webinar series has been designed to help you implement these significant changes in your organisations. The great news is that whilst this framework is based on the NDIS, it can be used to support any change process. With me today is Claire Edwards, author of the playbook, and the change expert who will guide us through this webinar series. Claire lives and breathes healthcare transformation, and she's worked with a range of public, not-for-profit and private healthcare organisations over the last 2 decades. Claire combines best practice research and evidence-based methodologies to get serious results. Also joining us today is our guest speaker, Dr. Emily Versteeg. As a self-confessed reformed research academic, tech startup survivor and public policy analyst, Dr. Versteeg has more than 15 years of experience working within the health and human services sector. Dr. Versteeg has recognised the growing trend of organisations putting people at the heart of everything that they do, and has a strong track record of successfully capturing and integrating consumer voice into strategy and governance frameworks. As outlined on your screens, there will be opportunities to ask questions at the end of the webinar. But for now, please welcome Claire Edwards with webinar 2, Setting Your Direction.
Hi everyone, and welcome to what is our second webinar in this series. And today's webinar really focuses in on one element of the framework, the Leading Change framework, which is setting your direction. And we spoke a little bit at the last webinar about the importance of setting your direction, and these are the first plays, if you like, that you need to instigate and implement as part of your play, as part of the playbook. Setting your direction has 3 parts to it. We look at the current state, the future state, and the transition state. And what we know is that for any change process to occur, it needs to go through all 3 states. So we're always moving through a current state, through a transition state, into a future state. However, when it comes to implementing these plays, we in fact need to look at them in a slightly different sequence. And the first play that we look at is understanding our current state. And what we find is when organisations start to look at their current state, there are many different views and perspectives on what the actual current state of the organisation is. And this isn't only unique in the context of the NDIS transition. Many organisations find that there are conflicting views between different areas that may be delivering services under the NDIS or different functions or roles within a health service. The understanding and the reason that we work on understanding the current state is so that we can understand how big the gap might be between where we are and where we want to get to. So really, the focus of current state, there are 3 tools that we use, and understanding the current state can be applied at a strategic level. So if the organisation is looking to change its strategy, we can use the tools. It can also be applied at a function, service, team, process level. And so these are really important things to think about, because when trying to understand the current state of something, we need to really be able to define what we're looking at. So we don't start to look at a function and then move into, oh, hang on, that sits within a team. We focus in on what the function is, if that's the thing that we're looking to change. So we need to be really clear about the change that we're looking at to begin with. And once we're clear on that, we can then start to examine the current state. And when we look at the current state, the very first tool that we look to use is the overview strategy. And in the overview strategy, there are 5 elements that we're looking at. We're looking at the purpose. So if we're looking at a particular process that you might be undertaking within the organisation, so we're looking at the different steps within a process, we might say, well, why does this process exist and why does it matter? So a process could be anything from a billing system that you might have, the booking system that you use. It could be the assessment process that you have in place in relation to working out what each individual client may be eligible for as part of their NDIS package. So it's looking at in this instance, if we're looking at a very specific process, it's looking at what is the purpose of that process and why does it matter. Next part of the strategy overview is to actually look at who we are in service to. So who is it that this process affects? So is it our clients that are affected by this process? Is it a particular process that's in fact funded by a third party, and therefore we need to be considerate of what their needs may be in relation to the process that we're undertaking? It could be, if we stick with the example of looking at our assessment process, trying to work out what an individual might be eligible for, it could be that we need to factor in that who we're in service to as part of this process is not only clients and funders, but we may also be in service to referrers who are connecting clients into services, like a brokerage agency, for example. So we need to list who is it that in fact is impacted by, or that we've set this process up for. And as I said, if we're clear on the purpose and why it matters, that's really critical. The next part is our values, which is how do we go about delivering this current process. And so our values considered an organisational level, and we'll often have organisational values, but even within an organisation, what you might find is that there are some subcultures. And so when I think about current state and how we go about delivering a process or a service, I'd often like to use the way of thinking of going, how would our clients, so the people that we've just identified, how would they say we in fact deliver this process? So what would they be saying about us? Would they say that we're really efficient and we're fast in terms of our assessment process? Would they say that we're slow and clunky and we never get back to people? So what are the values? How is it that we are behaving in relation to this process? And how would our clients describe our behaviour? And they're the things that you're capturing in the current state. Now, this is where people get a little bit tense and a bit find it quite difficult, because how they think they're behaving versus how they actually are seen to be behaving can be 2 different things. And so it's really important. We're looking at the current state. We're looking at what is, not what we would like it to be. That's in the future state. The next part of the process is looking at our strategic priorities. So what are the priorities that sit within that process? So it could be things like, and this is where we would look at, what are the actions that you take each and every day in relation to the process? And you'd get all the staff that are involved in implementing the process to write down each and everything that they do. Then you'd be looking for themes around that, and they become your priority themes that currently exist. So if it's the assessment process, there could be an area that's about fielding inquiries. There might be another priority that's actually about data entry and data control. There might be another section that's actually about collaboration and partnering, because once an assessment's done, it's about working out which parts of the organisation might deliver those services. So in a process, there's going to be some key things that need to occur, and we're trying to identify what are those things that are occurring on a regular basis. The last part of the strategy overview is actually looking at the metrics that are attached to the process or to the function or to the strategy, depending on what your change is that you're focusing on. The metrics are critically important, and we often find I often find when working with organisations, particularly around their current state, that this is the area that there's quite a bit of a gap, or people will have measures but they won't have goals, or they'll have measures but the measures are what I would say output measures. So they're things like volume of, they're measures that are associated with how many people are, who's doing what function, is how many people move through a process, the number of inquiries that might be made, for example. And that's great if you've at least got some of those measures in place. But what we're really looking for here is, are there goals that the organisation set, whether it be at a strategic level or even at an operational level, that this particular process that you may be reviewing or looking at or looking to change, are there goals that exist within there? And by goals, we're really looking for outcomes. What's the difference as a result of you doing this process, as a result of you investing time, energy and effort into this work? What's the difference that you're trying to make? And what's the difference that you're trying to make should be attached to your purpose, why this process exists. And it also should be attached to the outcomes that your clients would be looking for. So that who line. So as we're going through the current state, we're constantly rechecking in to ensure we've got our purpose right, that we've got who we're in service to right, we've got the functions right, and we understand what we currently measure and what we currently capture. Often I find organisations, as I said, when it comes to the metrics component of current state, it's very light, or in fact in many instances it's lacking. People don't know why a process exists, and therefore they're not sure what the difference the process should be making or what it should look like, or they're clear on what it should look like, but they're in fact not measuring if it's achieving that or not. And I think this is really critical when we start to delve into current state. There's a further 2 tools that I've put in the playbook, and these further 2 tools are the client journey and the service blueprint. And I've included those in specifically if you're looking at a process change or a function change, or it could be that you're looking to change a business model. So I don't often use the client journey or the service blueprint when we're looking at strategy. But when it comes to operational change, I think these 2 tools will really help you understand what's currently happening. And they're the same tools that get used in the future state. So if you do current state really well, future state becomes really easy because it's the same tools that we're using, but we're just designing a new desired state. So the client journey and the service blueprint are really taking those individuals that you've identified in who you're in service to and looking at what is their journey, what are the steps that are occurring. So we're wanting to know what is it that they're doing in their client journey. We want to know what are the outcomes. So as a result of them taking an action, what was the outcome that they were looking for? We want to understand what kind of questions they might have. And also we want to understand where their pain points might be or where the process works really well for them. And this is about, as I said, mapping what currently happens. And you're in a beautiful position with current state because you've already got clients, you've already got individuals that are having these experiences. So you can ask them exactly, what did you do? What were you trying to achieve as a result of doing that? How did that make you feel? Did it work well? Were you confused? Was it a really simple process to go through, or was it really actually quite confusing and you had to take multiple steps and still your outcomes that you were looking for weren't being achieved? So it's really important when looking at that client journey, we're looking at each step an individual takes. We're looking at what are the objectives they're trying to achieve, and we're doing this from their voice, not from an organisation's perspective. We're not pulling out our policy or our procedure manual and going, well, this is what should happen, and then that should happen, and then this should happen. Because as we know, when things are implemented on the ground, quite often what's actually occurring versus what might be documented in a policy or a procedure document is in fact quite different. So this is about understanding your current state. What is happening now? And as you go through this process, what you'll identify pretty quickly is where there is any divergence or deviation from what you thought should be happening, or what might be documented in your policy and your procedure versus what's actually happening. And what actually happening might be better than what's documented, but it's just about raising your awareness to that. The service blueprint is the complementary part to the client journey. So for every client action, there generally will be a business reaction. There's something that the organisation is doing when the client is doing an action. So for example, if a client is trying to find your organisation and they're doing research about who might be able to deliver services for them, the correlating action that the organisation might be taking is, do we have a communications policy in place? Is our website up to date? Are the correct details loaded in the multiple service directories that people can get access to? We might be attending field days or doing promotional events or having stalls at conferences to raise people's awareness. So there's a whole heap of correlating actions that can occur at the same time a client is taking an action. And what we're trying to do in the service blueprint is understand who's doing what infrastructure they're using, what documentation might be in place that supports them to take that action. And we're also trying to identify where there might be multiple parts of the organisation that could be involved. So even in something as simple as awareness raising, what you can often find is there's multiple parts of an organisation involved, doing a whole range of different activities, all trying to achieve a similar objective and outcome, some being successful, some being unsuccessful, but collectively there's a lack of awareness in the organisation about all the activity that's going on and whether or not that is a good investment of time, energy and effort. So the service blueprint follows the same process or function, and so you're trying to map all of those different moving parts. What we sometimes find in an organisation is that when a process is getting reviewed, we'll look at a policy or a procedure document in isolation rather than actually looking at how does it work in action. And so this is what the client journey and the service blueprint are doing. They're looking at how the different policies, the different parts of the organisation actually work in unison or in fact work in conflict with one another in the current state. So what's actually happening as of today. The other beautiful thing about the service blueprint and the client journey is that if you have been capturing any measurements or metrics, you can also overlay where those metrics kick in. So it could be that you might be measuring the number of inquiries that you're having. So you'd put that, in your process when you go through. If you hit the inquiry process, you can now put a data element attached to the action. And so you might say, oh, well, we're getting 400 inquiries per week. Then you can actually look at what's happening after the inquiries. Are you having a drop-off in terms of people following through in accessing the service, which may mean that the quality of the interaction around those inquiries isn't quite where it needs to be. Or it could be that it's creating further confusion that makes it difficult for people to proceed on their journey. So putting the data points in gives you a really good indication of why things might happen after, and also what it is that you might need to do or you might be able to do before that can affect and influence that particular data point. So you can overlay your data on top of this, you can overlay financial information over the top of these processes and put them in exactly in the actions or in that, whether it's from a service perspective or whether it's actually from a client perspective, you can overlay those data points in. And that starts to give you a really good current state picture of, in fact, what's going on. And I think so often in healthcare, it's about finding solutions, it's about finding answers, it's about solving problems. And we jump into the future state and going, well, this is how it could be and this is how it should be, without really understanding what is working, what isn't working, who's involved, how well is what we're doing, in fact, affecting the purpose or the intent behind why we're doing things. And so the sooner and the faster that we can do that piece of work, the easier it becomes to design your future state. Because once you look at your current state, you'll see that there are some very clear areas that could improve straight away. So if you're looking at the client journey, you might say, oh, hang on, the client has to go through 20 steps. Maybe we could make it 10. You might also see from a service blueprint perspective that you've got multiple people doing duplication of effort, there's double up of information, there's mishandling of information, there might be collection of data at one point, and then you're collecting it again at another point and going, hang on, why are we asking the client the same questions in the same format from two different areas, but for the same intent and same purpose? So all of a sudden, when you start to populate your future state, so in your future state, you're looking at your change strategy, your client journey, your business blueprint again, you're designing that for the difference that you want to see from your current state. And you can make, when you're looking at that future state, it can be quite close to where you currently are, or it could be a bit of an extra stretch. Also, in your future state, you're looking at the context within which you're going to be operating. So what's changing outside of the organisation that you might need to factor in? And as we know, with the NDIS transition, there's quite a bit of change that's occurring that will need to be factored in. It could be, oh, we need to look at how we fund this. It could be that we need to look at who's delivering what part of it. It could be looking at how we're capturing information and data. So the future state is a mirror of the current state tools. It's just applying where do we want to be. So what are our new goals and measures? And particularly if you don't have those metrics in place in the current state, this is now your opportunity to develop the right measures so that you're clear about where you're investing time, energy and effort is in fact having the impact and the outcome that you want to achieve. And so I think in future state, the real critical part that organisations need to focus on, and part of the reason that we've got Emily here today, is to really hone in on those measures, those metrics, those goals, those objectives, and to do that well, because that'll let you know if you're just busy doing activity and doing action for the sake of doing activity and action versus actually doing the right things that are going to achieve the right outcomes and also help your organisation to progress. Now, that's as tricky as the future state gets, and once you've done some context mapping, which is looking at politically what's changing, environmentally what's changing, geographically what's changing, policy, procedure-wise, what might be changing financially. So there's a range of things that you'll be aware of that are shifting. Map those out. Put in your change, populate your change strategy, which is the same information. You're saying, why are we doing this? Who are we doing it for? How are we going to do it? What is it that we're going to do? And how are we going to measure it to know that we're in fact achieving success, that we're actually making a difference, that we can stop doing things that aren't progressing the organisation or aren't having a positive impact on our clients. So that's what the future state is. The transition state is essentially looking at, if this is where we are and this is where we want to be, what falls out of that? What endures? So what stays the same? So what are the things that we need to maintain? What are the things that we now need to develop? What are the things that we don't quite know enough about that we might need to review? What are the things that we need to stop? So what are the things that need to conclude? And then what are the things that need to improve? So they're already in place, but they need to improve, which is slightly different to develop, because develop is about creating new things. So there's 5 things that we're looking at for a transition plan. What needs to be maintained? What needs to be improved? what needs to be developed brand new, what needs to be stopped and concluded, and what is it that we need to review because we don't have a good enough understanding of it at this point in time. Now, they're the things that get populated into your transition plan, and they're the key areas that now become the changes that you focus on in the implementation stage of the Leading Change framework. So that's how the three areas connect in. You do your current state, and I would say invest more time in understanding your current state because it makes the future state so much easier. And your transition state automatically falls out of understanding where you are, where you want to get to, because now you'll know what you need to do to be able to get there. Now with that, that's a lot from me about current state, future state and transition state. And I really want to hone in on, because it's the part that organisations struggle the most with, is the part of measurement. And why do we need to measure? And a lot of people ask me when they look at the framework and they've gone through the framework, they're saying, Claire, we're measuring stuff all the time. We're always looking for evidence. We're always looking for data points, whether it's quantitative or qualitative. Why do we need to measure? And with that, I think the best person to answer why we need to measure is Emily. So Emily, why do we need to measure?
For all the reasons that you've just mentioned, Claire, I think as we transition to the NDIS, the thing that is just so fundamentally important is the idea that for the very first time and on so many different levels, we have consumers who have the opportunity to exercise true choice. So our organisations, whereas once we're healthcare service providers or community service providers, and we're used to doing business in a very different way, but now our consumers have the choice as to who they take their service from. And that means that we need to be responsive to our customers or our consumers' needs, because money goes where people go and people go where their friends go. So it's really, really important for us to understand who we're serving, as you said, Claire, who we're serving and what their needs are. And like it or not, measurement comes into that. As everything that you just said, we need to measure because we need to know what we're doing well, what we're not doing so well, and what we're going to need to do to bridge that gap between the current and future states. What do we do? What actions do we need to take, and in what priority do we need to take those? And we need to have some kind of sensible information about we can't do everything. Obviously, we've got 24 hours a day, and we need to be able to prioritise on the basis of what our organisation is trying to achieve, who we're trying to achieve for, how much money we've got, and other things that we've got on our plate. So really good quality performance information is absolutely critical to understanding all of that.
Excellent. And Emily, you talk about quite often, and I've seen some of your webinars and those sorts of things and know you quite well. You talk about the 3 reasons that we need to measure, and I think I'd really love you to talk about those 3 things because I think they're so relevant in this setting.
Yeah, well, I reckon there are 3 things that we need to measure and 3 reasons why. So there are 3 E's: efficiency, effectiveness, and experience. So efficiency is about, are we spending our money in the best way possible? Could we be spending it differently to achieve a better or a different outcome? And I'd just like to pick up on that language too that Claire touched on as well. We are looking at spending our money in a way that's going to do more than just fuel processes. We want our clients, we want our organisation to be seeing impact and outcome and longer term outcomes in particular. So efficiency measures will help us understand that. Effectiveness measures are around, are we delivering our services in the best way possible? Could we be doing something different? Could we do something better? Do we need to do more or less of something? And experience, like this is my real passion piece. Are we delivering services in a way that makes a difference to people? And Claire mentioned a couple of different people groups, our consumers obviously, but others within our organisation, our stakeholder organisations, the community, our board, referral agencies, etc. So efficiency, effectiveness and experience measures are really critical.
And I think you've touched on something that comes up quite often in the playbook that I talk about. Organisations have a responsibility not just to themselves, but obviously to their clients that they're in service to, but also they don't exist in this vacuum. They don't exist in a bubble, that they also have a responsibility to the broader ecosystem that they exist within. So whether that's the healthcare ecosystem, the community services sector, their geographic location, they're connected in so many ways. And so I think, you know, when they're focused on outcomes and really driving those sorts of things, they can have such a big impact, these organisations, both at that client level, making sure their organisation is doing well, and also that the ecosystem is then thriving, and making sure people are getting to the right services at the right time and the right place, and those sorts of things. Now, Emily, you've worked a lot with NDIS transition leaders, and I know when I've worked with them as well, I've found that performance measurement is sometimes not done, and it's not done because it's hard. It's hard to know where to start. It's also hard to go, oh, we're required to measure so many things from a compliance perspective. Isn't that enough? So how do you approach getting started? Like, I'm really like, because this is it's the challenge for change. It's where do they start for change? But where do they start for developing performance measures or getting these metrics right that I'm telling them that they need to do? Where do they start?
Start small, start simple. And I think one of the reasons it's not done is because it can feel overwhelming, and, you know, well, we're doing all this stuff, like how can we possibly measure everything that we're doing? And you've spoken about a couple of different frameworks, particularly at the operational level, looking at the client journey and the service blueprint and picking up on measures that map to those. Often a lot of the work that I do is at the strategic level as well, and we really work with organisations to develop a logic. We call it a program logic, and it helps join up the program inputs, so the stuff that you put into the work that you do, the outputs that you see, and the impacts, and then the outcomes longer term, and to join them up in a logical flow. And once you've done that, then it becomes really easy to see, well, if we do this activity, these are the results that we're going to expect. And I think, you know, it's a little bit like when you go on a diet or you start a new fitness training program. Like, your goal might be, for instance, to run a 5K event in 10 weeks time. Well, okay, that's your goal. So how are you going to reverse engineer from there? So what are the things that you're going to need to do, and how are you going to know that you've hit those milestones? Well, obviously, you know, you've got to buy some joggers, and you've got to start eating right, and so those are the markers of success. And I think that if you can remember that a goal is where you're going and a measure is your marker of success or your marker of progress, I think that can be a way of cutting through the clutter. And we've done this very recently with a mental health service provider in Western New South Wales, and their goal is to increase people's mental well-being and their resilience, their mental health resilience. And so that's their long-term goal. And then we've reverse engineered from there. And I think it's as simple and as complicated as that. So get very clear, using whatever tools you need to, on how you expect to exert an effect, and then pick some key measures that sit around those. Strip everything else away and give it a go at understanding whether or not you've got that data, and if you've got that data, is it any good? And if you don't have it, where are you going to get it from? Start a conversation that way. Start small and iterate.
And I think, you know, so often, and this is probably more in the implementation piece that I see come up exactly as you've spoken about, is that people get so focused on the end goal and forget to put what those markers are along the way. And so I think also that's one of the things that contributes to why change can be so disheartening. Because if people are always just looking at that longer term goal and they're not sure what those indicators of success are along the way, it can feel like, oh, we're just never going to get there. And I think that's where change efforts kind of fall into this lackluster, oh, we're doing all this work, we're exerting all this energy, and we're in fact not seeing that difference. Yeah. And it's exactly as you touched on, those kind of indicators along the way. It's like, well, we're not closer to running 5K. We still feel like we're back at the beginning.
Yeah. And I think too, also because things are changing so rapidly, it's really important to have short feedback loops. So you're getting that fast feedback and a very early indicator of success or the lack thereof, so that you can respond faster. There's no point in collecting a measure every 6 months, because it could be that 6 months is too late for certain types of measures like client satisfaction.
Yeah. And I love the fact that you spoke about, you know, the work that you do is that's also at that strategy level, because I think it's really important that people do have that line of sight between a particular process or a function that they might be doing within an organisation, and that line of sight through to what the organisation's strategic goals might be and measures of success are, and how those two kind of connect in. I think quite often people reflect that, oh yeah, there's a strategy in the organisation and it's got those goals and measures, but that's got nothing to do with the real work that we're doing. So how do you you spoke a little bit about the program logic. Sounds like a really great way of thinking about bridging that gap, but have you got any other suggestions around how you kind of bridge that divide a little bit between the strategic and the operational, and how people can see those maybe more smaller measures are contributing towards those larger goals?
Yeah, I think it all starts with a really good mapping exercise, and again, using whatever kind of tool it takes to get there. But I am such a simple, pragmatic person. I like to keep it all as simple as possible. And you're so right when you say that, you know, there is more meaning and there is more connectedness and there is more kind of relevance in the work that we do in a program or a service delivery level if we can connect it to a higher level strategic objective. So I'm all for creating like a really simple high level strategic map, and then doing the diligence of mapping our programs or our products or our processes back up to those, so that we could, as an individual, say, you know, we're delivering this transition to work program, and our organisational strategic objective is to increase, you know, community capacity. Well, how are those two things linked? And to make sure that the comms that we have and the processes that we have, like the lower order and the higher order level things, match up. And really, that's as simple as having, you know, a big whiteboard or a big bit of butcher's paper and like drawing some lines between things, and then attaching activities and metrics to those.
Right, that's brilliant advice as always. Now, can you tell me the difference? Because healthcare, we love a good audit.
Yes.
We love, so often when I'm brought into an organisation to do this direction piece, quite often this is the piece that organisations will bring an external consultant or an independent in to do, is go, we think we've got some problems here. Here's some data that we've done from an audit that we've undertaken and it's not looking as good as it should. Help us. And I think people do get confused between kind of audit, compliance measures, and then performance measures. And sometimes I think even organisations get confused between the three and don't necessarily call a measure for what it is, particularly where it might be a compliance measure. Yep, the reason that we're capturing this data is to ensure we receive funding from this organisation, versus the performance measure, actually this is as a result of receiving that funding, these are the outcomes that we'd like to see for our community.
Yeah. And
how they can be different.
Yeah, and I mean, that's exactly the difference. I think audit and compliance exists for to support organisations to deliver the safest, most certain service that we can. You know, we want to make sure that, you know, there are rules in place for who gets what, you know, what drug and why and when and how and who touches it. There are obviously very, very clear rules and reasons for doing that. And we collect data points around those things, which may or may not indicate a problem. And I think if performance measurement is being done correctly, then the two things intersect. Performance measurement should help us understand if there is there is an audit or a compliance problem, and vice versa. But the performance measurement itself is more about the doing the best with what you have, which is what I mentioned before. So that's about efficiency and effectiveness. And really, when you're starting to, so we set those performance measures to give us an indicator of progress, but then we can deepen down into those performance measures, measurement data points for learning. And I think that that's probably the biggest difference between audit and compliance, which is about, rules and regulations and safety and funding and quality and efficiency and all of those kinds of things. Whereas performance measurement is about progress, and it can be used to inform learning, to improve service delivery.
One of the things that I'm kind of interested in is, what are the measures that actually matter? Like, we could measure anything and everything, and I think sometimes we become overwhelmed with measuring so much, and if we're unsure or we don't want to make a decision, we often will throw in, let's measure more. So, or let's get more data, and that doesn't necessarily help break that overwhelm. So, or it doesn't give us the clarity we might need to take action. So I'm kind of interested, what are the metrics that matter?
The metrics that matter are the metrics that matter to your organisation. Now, if we've done those steps that I talked about before, where we have a very clear understanding of the organisational strategy, and we've mapped our programs of work back to the organisational strategy, and the organisational strategy kind of articulates or, taps into our organisational values. So if we understand that, and we understand our programs of work, then the metrics that matter are the ones that are going to help us show our improvement and our progress against each of those things. And I really think it's as simple as that. I absolutely understand that one of the, when particularly we're in this kind of service provider funder relationship, our funders can tell us, or, we've got to measure all of this kind of stuff. And I think that it does lead to overwhelm, and it leads to fatigue, and it leads to frustration. So I think we've got to absolutely simplify our performance measurement as much as we possibly can to ensure that that we have good quality data that's available quickly, and that we can use sensibly to make decisions that affect our strategic decisions. The simpler, the better, I think, Claire.
Yeah. Now, you often talk about kind of the 3 Ps, the people, process and package. Can you explain that a little bit more to the people that are listening today? Because I think it's elegant and it's quite simple. And so I think it's a really useful way for people to that are struggling to start to frame some of their thinking.
Yeah. So people, process and package. So people, it's obvious, it's about the people who use our service. So what information do we need about the people who use our service, or our support packages, and we're looking for deep information. And I think, particularly when it comes to people, we're looking for deep information about who uses the service, what services they might use it in combination with, who uses the services a lot or a little, who uses our service in combination with others. And I think that many of the really important point here, when it comes to people measures, a lot of this information is not going to come from quantitative performance measurement. It's going to need to be supported by qualitative data points. And we've spoken about performance measurement kind of to this point as if it was just only numbers on a page or in a spreadsheet, and it's absolutely not. Particularly when it comes to client or consumer experience, talking to the people who use your services or talking to your stakeholders is absolutely golden in terms of feedback, and it's also morally right. We need to be talking and understanding what our consumers need and want when it comes to our service. The second P is process, and Claire's spoken in detail about processes. So we need to have some, and in many instances this will be quantitative, measures around how we're performing financially, our intake, our assessment processes, our safety and quality, and there may be a little bit of compliance and audit kind of numbers in there. And package, we need to understand what we're delivering and to whom. So that kind of comes back to, what does a package look like? Does it, what are the components of services that people are consuming? we want to understand, again, this links back to people. We want to understand what people need and how we need to improve, or things that we might need to develop and do differently to meet the needs of our market.
And I love it because I think the people, process and package bit speaks to that, the who, the how and the what. Exactly. Which is exactly, the key elements that I've said. If you understand those things within your organisation and you can map them in your current state and you're clear about them in the future state, all of a sudden it makes some of what are the measures that then fall out of that a lot clearer.
Yeah.
Now, I often, people go, oh, but the who sounds really broad, the how and the what we do so much, how do we actually narrow some of that down? How do we bring it in when it feels so big?
So big, yeah. And I think to sound like a broken record, it's really about getting clear and focused on what's your organisation about, what are your values, what are you trying to achieve, what's your strategy, linking that back down to your programs of work and asking ourselves, is this meaningful? Does this metric matter? And really simplifying it through that lens so that we're not trying to, wasting our time and our effort on scattering our focus, when really we can just narrow it down to the information that's going to help us make great decisions within our business.
Now I'm going to ask you, this is the one that everyone loves, is what is the impact of measurement? Because I often see what the impact is of not measuring. And the impact of not measuring is possibly some of the counter things that you're going to say is the benefits of measuring. But I often find that organisations actually become, when we do the current state analysis and we get to this part of, so what are your goals, what are your measures, and because we're focusing in on a function, a process, a service it could be, or it could be a package of services, they just kind of go, no, we don't measure anything. Oh, maybe that's been our problem. And I don't think measurement is the solution. It's not necessarily the panacea, but it does provide some really useful context, and it provides some really useful information so that you can then make a more informed decision moving forward. So I'd really love to hear from you what you feel the impact of measurement is, because I think so many people feel the impact of either measuring the wrong stuff, measuring too much, measuring for measuring's sake, or just they've gone through all of that and therefore they go completely the opposite and go, we're going to simplify. We're just not going to measure anything at all. So what is the impact of measurement?
Yeah, so when you get that, when you strike that balance between, we're out, we're not measuring anything, and we're going to measure everything, when you get that perfect balance in the middle, I tend to see that three things happen. The first thing, and it is so noticeable, is that consumer satisfaction starts to creep up. We start to see clients much more engaged, much more satisfied with the service that we're delivering, because we're actually using the performance measurement to understand our clients better and the services that we are delivering better. And so that creates a really nice little performance, a nice little feedback loop. And there is a very strong relationship between satisfied customers and happy staff, just FYI. We also start to see the service quality improve because we've got our eye on the ball and we're going, well, okay, we're incrementally improving towards a goal here. So service quality comes up. And finally, organisations that measure are far more sustainable because they know what's going on and they're making better informed decisions about, well, we've got a limited amount of money that we could be spending in a whole bunch of different ways, but we know that this one decision is going to deliver us bang for our buck. And so they're more sustainable.
I love those three things. And I think you really hit the nail on the head, I think, with the first one. Because I often find that I'm having to remind organisations that they're not there for organisation's sake. That the reason that an organisation exists, or that a healthcare business exists, or that a community service provider exists is that there's someone that needs something that they can't do or can't achieve themselves, or they can't access somewhere else. So the reason that your organisation exists, the reason that your business exists is, in fact, to make a difference to someone. And if we seem to lose that connection at times, that we don't necessarily value who it is that we're in service to. It's like, oh, yeah, we have to see someone else. Yeah, we've got another client. It's like, yes, but they're the reason that your organisation exists. If you're not making your clients happy, if you're not meeting their needs, there's no reason for your organisation to exist. Mm-hmm. And that might sound really, really harsh, but I think we've lost sight of that somewhere along the way. And I think with the changes that have happened with NDIS funding, I think that reality probably has come back, where we've moved from a process of block funding organisations to decide how they might like to deliver services and say, well, we do this and this and this. And clients kind of going, oh, yep, well, I'll go and I'll get a bit of that and I'll do that and do that, to that whole dynamic being flipped and saying, well, actually, I want A, B, and C, and I can go wherever I like to get that now. And if you're not going to deliver it in the way that I want, or it's not going to be easy to access, or it's not going to be cost effective, as a consumer, I don't see value, or you're not achieving the outcomes that you said you would, I can now start to shop around. And I think we've seen some really substantial statistics in NDIS in relation to that. And I know, Emily, you're quite across some of those statistics, and we were having a bit of a discussion about it. But I think, there are significant chunks of individuals who are now getting more familiar, I guess, with NDIS packages, how money is allocated, the decisions that they can make. And I think we've also got a whole heap of brokerage organisations that have popped up to assist clients to make informed decisions, and they're much more savvy in the market now as well. So I think we're really starting to see that shift from, I've always gone to this organisation, so whether they were block funded or now the money comes through me, I'm still going to go there. Some of that loyalty, I guess, is breaking down a little bit because people are feeling that, they're empowered to now make these decisions. What would you say in terms of what we might have measured versus what we now need to look at in terms of that dynamic shift? Because I think for the organisations we're speaking to today, that's the really big one.
I think it's been really interesting. So I'm going to answer your question quickly, but in a roundabout way. So the organisations that I'm working with now, as opposed to organisations I was working with about 5 or 6 years ago. 5 or 6 years ago, if I was talking about consumer satisfaction or consumer experience or business models, etc., they were like, we don't do business, we do healthcare, or we do community services. And that is what has changed. And I think organisations in the regulated market, like healthcare and community services, are now starting to transition to needing to think and measure like regular organizations. So, B2C kind of, Apples and Netflix and Facebook and Google, like those are the big, those organizations, those businesses are actually driving consumer expectations of what's possible. Everything has to be fast. It has to be available from the comfort of our couch through a mobile phone. So consumers have very, very high expectations of what we are going to deliver. Now, whether or not they're possible or not is a different thing, but that is what's driving the market, and that's what's driving consumer expectations. So I think the best thing that we can do is start to think and measure a little bit like some of those organisations in the regular market. So really focusing in on client experience or consumer experience, understanding the friction points, because we know that is a really strong driver of consumer dissatisfaction. So how can we optimise our processes to reduce consumer dissatisfaction around friction points? So starting to think a little bit outside the square, rather than more like a traditional community services healthcare service organisation, I think is going to give us the insight and the edge to sustainability.
Well, with that, I think that's a beautiful way to wrap up today. I'd really like to say thank you to Emily for being part of this webinar. I think you've shared an amazing amount of information, and really how we don't need to be scared of goals and measures, and that the importance of having them and how that can both be beneficial to clients, be beneficial to the organisation, and be beneficial more broadly in the ecosystem. And I think, hopefully you've energised and excited everyone about let's get out there and measure a bit better. And really, measurement is critical, I think, throughout any change process. And so what we've heard today is going to be just as relevant for the topic that we're talking about in our next webinar, which is about the implementation part of the process. And so I want to thank everyone for their attendance and participation today. I'm just going to put up one more slide, which is about the upcoming or the remaining webinar series, or the remaining webinars, sorry, to let you know that your registration for the remaining webinars is still open. We've got the next one on the 30th of May with the final one on the 20th of June. The next one really hones in on implementing change. Thank you all once again for your participation today and for listening in. A recorded copy of this webinar will be available through the VHA Wire portal, and also the previous webinar, which was setting the scene for leading change. I wish you all a great day, and I hope you now go out and back into your organisations and have some really great conversations about what is it that your current goals are and how you're measuring them, and what are the indicators that you've got along the way, and whether or not you need to rethink what you might have been calling a performance measure. Is it in fact audit and compliance? And so being really clear on some of those things. It's been great talking to you about direction. I hope that you all use the tools within the playbook and really start to think about what's your current state, what's the future state, and therefore what is it that needs to transition to enable change within your organisation. Look forward to talking to you on the 30th of May. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you all for your time today, and also to thank Claire and Emily for taking the time to share their knowledge, insights and experience. As I mentioned, a recording of this webinar will be made available on the VHA website, which you can use as a reference tool should you wish to revisit content from this session. Also, if you'd like to join any of the remaining webinars in the series, you can register for these on the VHA website. Webinar 3, Implementing Change, on the 30th of May at 12 p.m, and Webinar 4, Becoming a Catalyst for Change, will take place on the 20th of June at 8 a.m.